25 men in $1,000 suits couldn't open it. The greatest engineers in the city walked away sweating, fearing for their lives. Then came the girl with the lemon-scented bleach and bruised knuckles. It took her 60 seconds, one click, and the most dangerous man in the city stopped breathing. The study smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat. Lucien Vane sat in a winged leather chair that cost more than most people made in a decade, watching a man slowly lose his mind. The man was a structural engineer from Berlin. He was the 25th expert to stand before the massive iron-wrought vault embedded in the mahogany wall of Lucien's estate, and like the 24 men before him, he was failing. The vault was an antique. Forged in 1890, it was a beast of raw iron, brass gears and paranoia. It didn't have a digital keypad. It didn't have wires to splice or motherboards to hack. It was a purely mechanical nightmare of interlocking tumblers and weighted drop pins. And it was jammed! Inside sat the ledgers. Not the fake ones the accountants fed to the IRS, but the real ones. The blood ledgers. If that door didn't open by midnight, a shipment of weapons on the docks would sit idle. A cartel in Mexico would consider it a breach of contract, and a war would start that would burn the city to the ground. The microscopic tolerances, the engineer stammered, wiping a trembling hand across his damp forehead. His custom-tailored shirt clung to his back like a wet rag. The internal sear is bound. We tried sonic vibration. We tried thermal lances. If we apply any more pressure, the glass plate shatters and the deadbolts permanently lock. It's a brick, Mr. Vane. You have to blow the wall. Lucien didn't blink. His eyes were flat, the colour of slate under deep water. He rested his chin on his steepled fingers. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist ticked in the suffocating silence. "Blow the wall," Lucien repeated. His voice was quiet. It didn't echo. It sank into the heavy Persian rugs. Blow the load-bearing wall of a house that has stood for 120 years, thereby burying the paper ledgers inside in a mountain of burning rubble. That is your professional advice. The engineer swallowed hard. The sound was horribly loud. Yes. In the periphery of the room, standing by the heavy oak double doors, Bastien shifted his weight. Bastien was Lucien's shadow. He didn't wear custom suits. He wore dark wool and shoulder holster that ruined the line of his jacket. Bastien's hand hovered, just a fraction of an inch near his lapel, the universal sign that the engineer's time on Earth was rapidly concluding. 10 feet away, on her hands and knees, Maeve scrubbed the baseboards. She was invisible. That was the first rule the housekeeper had beaten into her head when she took the job. You are dust. You are a ghost. You do not look at them. You do not listen to them. And you do not speak. Maeve's knees burned against the hardwood. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache that she usually drowned in cheap ibuprofen. The harsh, chemical stink of lemon-scented ammonia burned her nostrils, masking the expensive cigar smoke that clung to the heavy velvet drapes. She scrubbed methodically in tight overlapping circles. Her hands were raw, the skin split around the cuticles, stained red from hot water and harsh lye. But she wasn't focusing on the baseboards. She was listening. She had been in the room for 3 hours, quietly moving behind the furniture, while a parade of men in expensive glasses brought in laser micrometers, stethoscopes, and hydraulic tensioners. She had listened to the vault. It didn't sound like a microscopic engineering marvel to her. It sounded like the rusted cast-iron radiator in the Bronx tenement where she grew up, the one that used to scream and seize up in the dead of winter. The engineer picked up a rubber mallet and tapped delicately against the brass dial. Tink, tink. Maeve winced. He was doing it wrong. The whole room felt wrong. The heavy air-conditioning vent above the vault was blasting freezing air directly onto the century-old metal. The brass was cold. The iron was cold. The sweat on the engineer's neck was cold. "Time is a luxury I'm entirely out of," Lucien said, standing slowly. He was a tall man, moving with a predatory, restless energy that made the air in the room feel thinner. He unbuttoned his suit jacket. "Bastien, get him out of here. Find someone who doesn't suggest I dynamite my own house." "Wait, please!" The engineer backed up. his expensive loafers scraping against the floorboards. "No one can open this! The pins are seized!" "They're not seized." The voice was raspy, quiet. It didn't belong in the room. Silence fell. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a car crash. Lucian stopped moving. Bastian froze, his hands slipping inside his jacket. The engineer turned, his face pale. Maeve stayed on her knees, the damp scrub brush still gripped in her raw hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she didn't lower her head. She looked up past the bucket of dirty grey water, past the terrified engineer, straight into the dead slate eyes of Lucian Vane. "Excuse me?" Lucian's voice dropped an octave. It was a razor wrapped in velvet. Maeve swallowed. Her throat was dry from the ammonia fumes. She had broken the cardinal rule. She was supposed to be a ghost. But the noise in her head, the sheer agonizing stupidity of watching these men poke at a hunk of metal while the AC blasted on it, had finally broken her. "They aren't seized," Maeve repeated, pushing herself up from the floor. Her uniform, a drab grey cotton dress that was 2 sizes too big, rustled. "They're frozen, and he's babying the primary gear. If you tap a seized pin like a watchmaker, it just wedges tighter against the track." Bastian drew his weapon, a sleek black chunk of steel. He didn't point it, but he held it by his side. "Shut up, girl, get back in the kitchen." Lucian held up a single hand, 2 fingers raised. Bastian stopped instantly. Lucian turned his full, terrifying attention on Maeve. He took in the cheap rubber soles of her shoes, the fraying hem of her grey uniform, the bruised knuckles, and the messy knot of dark hair falling out of its clip at the nape of her neck. He was looking for fear. He was used to fear. But Maeve wasn't afraid of him. She was tired. She had worked a 14-hour shift. She had a bus to catch, rent to pay, and a landlord who didn't care about Mafia turf wars. She looked at Lucian Vane the way a mechanic looks at a broken carburetor. "Explain," Lucian said softly. "It's physics," Maeve said. Her voice gained a fraction of steadiness. She wiped her wet, chemical-smelling hands on her apron. "It's an iron door with a brass locking mechanism. Different metals expand and contract at different rates." She pointed up at the ceiling vent. "You've got the central air blasting at 62 degrees right onto the face of the dial. The brass contracted faster than the iron track. The anti-tamper pins didn't drop. They squeezed themselves tight. They're shivering." The engineer let out a hysterical scoff. "Shivering? Are you insane? This is a Class A vault, not a rusty pipe. You don't know what you're talking about, you little—" "I know," Maeve cut him off, her tone flat and completely devoid of respect. "That you've been tapping it with a rubber toy for an hour, and all you did was wedge the primary pin deeper into the groove." She walked past the engineer. She didn't ask for permission. She just walked up to the vault, smelling faintly of bleach and exhaustion, and laid her bare palm flat against the massive iron door. "Cold," she muttered. She turned to Lucian. "You smoke." It wasn't a question. She had cleaned his ashtrays. Lucian watched her, his eyes narrowed. "I do." "Give me your lighter." Bastian let out a low hiss of warning. "Boss, she's a nobody. She's crazy. Let me get her out of—" "Bastian," Lucian said. The word snapped like a whip. He reached into his trousers and pulled out a heavy brushed silver Zippo. He walked across the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound. He stopped inches from Maeve. Up close, the contradiction was jarring. He was immaculate, smelling of sandalwood and danger, radiating power. She was dishevelled, smelling of labour, carrying the invisible weight of poverty. Yet when he handed her the lighter, their fingers brushed, and neither of them flinched. "If you break the glass plate," Lucian murmured, leaning down so only she could hear, "I will have Bastian break your hands. Both of them." Maeve looked at him. Her eyes were tired, dark, and utterly cynical. "If I break the glass plate, you won't have to. I won't be able to scrub floors, so I'll starve to death anyway." Lucian's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. No one spoke to him like that. No one weighed their life against his threats and found his threats lacking. Maeve flipped the Zippo open. The metallic clink echoed in the silent room. She struck the flint. The yellow flame flared, casting shifting shadows across the dark iron of the vault. She held the flame directly under the thick brass dial. "What is she doing?" the engineer hissed. "She's going to trigger the thermal locks." "Shut up," Lucian and Maeve said in unison. Maeve held the flame there. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The air began to smell of heated metal and lighter fluid. The brass started to sweat as the condensation burned off. She watched the dial with intense, narrow-eyed focus. She was waiting for the heat to transfer, for the brass to remember it was softer than iron, for the microscopic gap to widen just a fraction of a millimeter. 45 seconds. She snapped the lighter shut and shoved it into her apron pocket. She didn't hand it back. "Mallet," she demanded, snapping her fingers at the engineer without looking at him. The engineer stood frozen. Bastian walked over, snatched the heavy rubber mallet from the man's trembling hands, and practically threw it at Maeve. She caught it by the heavy wooden handle. "You've been tapping it," Maeve said, her voice low. She squared her shoulders, planting her cheap sneakers firmly on the expensive rug. "When old metal binds, you don't tap it." She swung the mallet back. She didn't aim for the delicate brass dial. She aimed for the thick iron casing housing the hinges, 3 feet to the left of the lock. "You shock it." She swung hard. The impact was deafening. Clang! The heavy thud reverberated through the floorboards, rattling the crystal decanters on Lucian's desk. The engineer let out a whimpering cry, ducking as if the vault were going to explode. Maeve immediately dropped the mallet, grabbed the heated brass dial with her bare, calloused hand, and twisted it hard to the right, throwing her entire body weight into it. There was a heavy, sickening grind of metal against metal, and then clack, 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 thud. The sound was deep, resonant, and beautiful. The sound of massive steel deadbolts sliding back into their housing. Maeve grabbed the heavy iron lever and pulled down. With a groan of centuries-old hinges, the massive door of the vault swung open, revealing the dark, secure belly holding Lucian's empire. Exactly 1 minute. Maeve let go of the handle. She blew out a slow breath, wiping a strand of damp hair from her forehead. She turned around. The room was paralyzed. The engineer looked like he was going to vomit. Bastian was staring at the open vault as if it were a magic trick. Lucian Vane stood perfectly still. The cynical, cold mask he wore for the world had cracked. His lips were slightly parted. He looked from the open vault to the heavy mallet on the floor, and finally to the girl in the oversized grey uniform. He was entirely, profoundly speechless. Maeve bent down, picked up the mallet, and handed it to the trembling engineer. Then she reached into her apron, pulled out the silver Zippo, and walked over to Lucian. She pressed the lighter into his palm. "Your AC is set too low," Maeve said. Her voice was flat. "It's bad for the wood floors too, makes the grain buckle." She walked past him, retrieved her bucket of dirty water, and went back to the baseboards near the door. She dropped to her knees and started scrubbing. "Scrub! Scrub! Scrub! Get out!" Lucian's voice broke the spell. It wasn't a shout, it was a low, dangerous growl. He didn't take his eyes off Maeve. The engineer didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled for his expensive aluminum tool cases, leaving half his gear behind, and practically sprinted for the double doors. Bastian followed him out into the hallway, shutting the heavy oak doors with a firm, echoing click. They were alone. The silence returned, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the frantic, ticking silence of a countdown. It was the heavy, charged silence of an unexploded bomb. Maeve continued scrubbing. She could feel the heat of his stare on the back of her neck. It made the fine hairs stand up. She knew she had made a mistake. You don't show a wolf that you know how to pick the lock on its cage. She should have kept her mouth shut, let them blow the wall, and collected her paycheck. But the mechanical wrongness of the situation had dragged the reaction out of her, an old habit from a past life. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Lucian walked over to the open vault. He reached inside, his hand brushing past stacks of banded cash and velvet boxes, until he found a simple, black external hard drive and a leather-bound ledger. He pulled them out, tossing them onto his mahogany desk with a heavy thud. Then he walked toward her. He stopped just a foot away from where she was kneeling. She saw the perfect crease of his dark trousers, the brilliant shine of his leather Oxfords. "Stand up." Maeve paused. She squeezed the soapy water from her brush into the bucket, dried her hands on her apron, and stood. She was not a tall woman. She had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. "Who are you?" Lucian asked. The question was a demand. He was dissecting her with his eyes, looking past the cheap uniform. "Maeve," she said. "I cover the third-floor east wing and the main study. Shift ends at 6. "I didn't ask your shift schedule, Maeve." He tested her name on his tongue. It sounded strange coming from him, too sharp. "I asked who you are. The men I bring into this room charge $20,000 an hour. They hold degrees from MIT and Zurich. They told me that door was a solid block of fused metal. You opened it with a lighter and a hammer." "They overthought it," Maeve said with a shrug, refusing to break eye contact. "Rich men usually do. They look for complex problems so they can justify their complex bills. I grew up fixing broken things because we couldn't afford to buy new ones. Metal is metal. Heat makes it expand. Cold makes it shrink. It's not magic, it's poverty." A dark, cynical amusement flickered in Lucian's eyes. It was a terrifying look. "Poverty," he repeated softly. "And where did poverty teach you the precise acoustic difference between a seized primary sear and a bound anti-tamper pin?" Maeve's breath hitched. A tiny, microscopic flaw in her armour. She masked it quickly, crossing her arms over her chest. "My father was a locksmith in the Bronx. Before he drank himself to death, he made me turn dials blindfolded until I could hear the clicks in my sleep. It was a lie. Mostly. Her father was a safecracker. A very good one. Until he crossed a local crew, took a bullet to the spine, and left her to pay off his debts. But Lucian Vane didn't need to know that. Lucian took a step closer. The scent of sandalwood and something distinctly violent washed over her. "You're lying." "I'm really not. Your heart rate just spiked. Your pupils dilated. You have a tell, Maeve. The left side of your jaw tightens when you admit the truth." He reached out, his long aristocratic fingers hovering inches from her cheek. He didn't touch her, but the ghost of his warmth made her skin prickle. "You know exactly what was in that vault, don't you?" "I know it wasn't a collection of vintage stamps," she replied smoothly. "But I don't care. I'm not a cop, I'm not a thief, and I'm not a rival. I'm a maid. I get paid $16 an hour. And if you don't mind, I have 3 more rooms to dust before the housekeeper docks my pay." Lucian laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, a genuine bark of disbelief. He walked back to his desk, picked up a heavy crystal tumbler, and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a decanter. He didn't offer her any. He drank it neat, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You aren't afraid of me," he noted. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fascination. "Should I be?" "Yes. I've got a landlord who screams in my face every morning because the rent is late. I ride the subway at 3 a.m. I've been mugged twice this year for a purse that had nothing but chapstick and a MetroCard in it." Maeve picked up her bucket. The dirty water sloshed against the plastic sides. "You wear $4,000 suits and live behind electric gates. You're dangerous, Mr. Vane, but you're abstract. My problems are immediate." Lucian set his glass down. The clink was loud in the quiet room. "Sit down," he ordered, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "My shift. I own the house. I own the housekeeper. Your shift is whatever I say it is. Sit down." Maeve hesitated. She looked at the door. Bastian was out there. She looked at the chair. Leather. Pristine. She looked down at her soiled apron and wet, chemical-stained hands. Slowly, deliberately, she walked over and sat. She didn't sink into the cushions. She sat on the edge, her spine rigidly straight, her bucket resting on the Persian rug beside her. Lucian rounded the desk and leaned against the edge of it, crossing his ankles. He was close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jawline, the exhaustion bruising the skin under his slate-grey eyes. "I have a problem, Maeve," Lucian said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur that felt infinitely more dangerous than his shouting. "My organisation is currently suffering from a surplus of pedigree and a deficit of competence. I have accountants who can't find leaks. I have security experts who can't open doors. I'm surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, right up until the moment it gets me killed." Maeve stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you just saved me a war." He picked up the heavy black ledger from his desk and tapped it against his palm. If I couldn't access this tonight, tomorrow morning there would be bodies on the streets. You saved my business. More importantly, you looked at a problem that terrified 25 educated men, and you solved it with a hammer and a cheap lighter. You see the mechanics of things. You see what is actually there, not what is supposed to be there. So what? Maeve let out a dry, cynical laugh. You're going to give me a bonus, a gold star, maybe buy me a better mop. Lucian leaned forward. His eyes locked onto hers. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I'm going to give you a job. Maeve gripped the rough fabric of her apron. I have a job. You have a sentence, Lucian corrected softly. Scrubbing floors to pay off someone else's debt. Yes, I know about the debt. Bastian ran a background check on the entire staff the day they were hired. Your father owes a considerable amount of money to the Petrov Syndicate. You've been paying them $1,000 a week for 3 years. Maeve went cold. The blood drained from her face, leaving her feeling lightheaded. The secret she had buried under layers of anonymity, under the smell of bleach and the ache of hard labour, was sitting right out in the open. If you know that, she whispered, her voice finally losing its hard edge, then you know I can't afford to play games with you. I need this paycheck. The Petrovs are animals, Lucian said dismissively. They bleed you slow. You will work as a maid until your knees give out, and you will still owe them the principal. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick silver money clip and tossed it onto her lap. It hit her thighs with a heavy, substantial thud. Maeve looked down. It was a roll of $100 bills, at least $10,000. That covers your debt for the month, Lucian said. Tomorrow you don't wear the grey uniform, you wear your own clothes. You come to this office at 8 in the morning. You're going to look at my ledgers. You're going to look at my security protocols. You're going to look at my problems the same way you looked at that vault. Maeve stared at the money. It was more cash than she had held in her entire life. It looked dirty. It looked like a trap. I'm not a criminal. Lucian smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. You aren't a maid either. But we all do things to survive. He leaned closer, until his voice was a rough whisper against the shell of her ear. Take the money, Maeve. Step out of the background, because whether you want to or not, you just proved to the most dangerous man in this city that you are entirely indispensable. He stood up, walking back behind his desk. 6 o'clock, your shift is over. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. Maeve sat there for a long moment. She looked at the open, dark maw of the iron vault. She looked at the terrifying, elegant man sitting behind the desk. She picked up the roll of cash. It felt heavier than the hammer. She stood up, grabbed her bucket, and walked out the heavy oak doors, knowing her life as a ghost was dead forever. The morning air tasted like diesel exhaust and damp pavement. Maeve stood at the wrought iron gates of the Vane estate at exactly 7:55 a.m. She wasn't wearing the shapeless grey cotton. She wore a faded black turtleneck, thick denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed leather boots she had bought second-hand in Brooklyn. She felt exposed. The uniform had been armour. It made her invisible. Today the guards at the gate looked at her. Really looked at her. Bastian was waiting at the front door. He didn't say good morning. He looked at her boots, then at her face. His expression caught somewhere between deep suspicion and offended pride. He opened the door and let her step into the foyer. He's in the study, Bastian grunted. Don't touch anything on the way. The house smelled different in the morning. The heavy scent of cigar smoke was gone, replaced by the sharp, bitter aroma of dark roast espresso and the subtle tang of lemon polish. Her polish. She knew exactly how hard the girl who replaced her had to scrub to get the floors to shine like that. She walked into the study. Lucian was behind the desk. He wore a crisp white shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the thick dark ink of a tattoo winding around his left wrist. The harsh morning sunlight cut through the velvet drapes, catching the silver of his lighter resting on the mahogany. Sit, he said, not looking up from a file. Maeve sat. The leather of the chair groaned softly. It was cold. Lucian closed the file and pushed the heavy black ledger across the desk. It stopped an inch from the edge. 3 accountants, Lucian began, leaning back and lacing his hands together. 2 from Chicago, 1 from London. They spent 40 hours looking at the operational costs of our waterfront shipping company. We are bleeding money. A slow, steady hemorrhage that is costing me hundreds of thousands a quarter. The accountants say the numbers balance. They say inflation, union dues, and fuel costs account for the deficit. They say it's the cost of doing business. He tapped a finger on the desk, a sharp, rhythmic sound. I don't believe in the cost of business, Lucian said quietly. I believe in theft. Find it. Maeve looked at the ledger. It was bound in thick, pebbled leather. She didn't open it immediately. I don't have an accounting degree, Maeve said, her voice flat. I can balance a checkbook, but I don't know corporate tax evasion. You didn't have an engineering degree yesterday, Lucian countered. You look at the mechanics of things. Numbers are just mechanics on paper. Look for the friction. Maeve reached out and pulled the heavy book toward her. The paper was thick, expensive. The ink was printed in tight, neat columns. She began to turn the pages. The silence in the room stretched. 10 minutes. 20. The only sound was the heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the dry rustle of paper. Lucian drank his espresso, watching her eyes track down the columns. Maeve didn't look at the high-level financial summaries. She ignored the offshore routing codes and the union payouts. She looked at the raw materials, the physical things required to make heavy machinery move. She stopped on page 42. She dragged her finger down a column labelled Vessel Maintenance and Sanitation. She stared at the numbers, her brow furrowed. She flipped back a page, then forward. She read the itemised receipts for dry dock cleaning supplies, industrial solvents, grease, and lye. A tight, cold knot formed in her stomach. She knew these numbers. She knew them intimately. You're being robbed, Maeve said. She didn't look up. Lucian stopped moving. Show me! Maeve spun the heavy ledger around and pushed it back across the desk. She stood up, leaning over the mahogany to point at the tight columns of black ink. Right there, industrial-grade degreaser. 400 gallons a month. And here, high-alkaline lye for the cargo holds. 2 tons a quarter. Lucian looked at the numbers, his expression darkening. These ships haul scrap metal and crude. They get filthy. The volume isn't entirely unreasonable. The volume isn't the problem, Maeve said. Her voice dropped, carrying the hard, cynical edge of a woman who had spent 5 years ordering these exact chemicals from wholesale catalogues to clean up after rich people. The price is the problem. Look at the unit cost. They're charging you $32 a gallon for the solvent. Wholesale, that solvent costs $14. I know, because I buy it for this house in 5-gallon buckets. Lucian's eyes flicked from the ledger to her face. It's not just the solvent, Maeve continued, her finger tapping hard against the paper. It's the lye. It's the wire brushes. It's the replacement filters for the industrial vacuums. Whoever is running your dock maintenance is buying cheap, watered-down supplies, billing you for top-tier industrial grade, and pocketing the difference. It's clean. The accountants missed it because the math is perfect. The totals match the fake invoices, but the reality doesn't match the math. You can't clean a crude oil spill with the amount of actual degreaser they're buying. Your ships must be rotting from the inside out. The study went deathly quiet. Lucian stared at the ledger. The slate grey of his eyes seemed to freeze over. The muscle in his jaw jumped. It was a terrifying, absolute stillness. He reached out and picked up the silver Zippo. He flipped it open. Clink. He closed it. Clack. Holden, Lucian said softly. Who? Holden, Lucian repeated, standing up. He runs the waterfront operations. He also manages the logistics for this estate, the maintenance, the climate control. Maeve froze. The climate control. She looked up at the heavy brass vent in the ceiling directly above the iron vault. The one that had been blasting freezing air. He didn't just rob you, Maeve whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The puzzle pieces slammed together in her mind. The vault. Yesterday. Lucian looked at her, his eyes narrowing. What about it? It wasn't an accident, Maeve said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stepped back from the desk. I told you the AC was set to 62 degrees, but it's a 120-year-old house. This room has a dedicated thermostat. I dust it every Tuesday. I saw it yesterday. It was set to 70. Lucian walked around the desk. His movements were slow, predatory. Are you telling me the temperature drop was localized? The vent was forced, Maeve said, pointing up. Someone rerouted the primary chiller directly to this duct and bypassed the room's thermostat. They intentionally froze the lock. They wanted the vault sealed. They wanted you to miss that weapon shipment. They wanted you to blow the wall. Lucian stopped inches from her. The smell of ozone and impending violence radiated off him. "If I blew the wall," Lucian murmured, the pieces falling into place. This structural collapse would have crushed the vault. The ledgers inside would be buried in rubble for days, or destroyed by the friction fires, and the evidence of Holden skimming $2 million a year would burn with it. Maeve swallowed hard. Yes. Lucian didn't shout. He didn't break anything. The true monsters never needed to raise their voices. He walked to the heavy oak doors, opened them a fraction of an inch, and spoke a single word into the hallway. "Bastian." Bastian appeared instantly. "Go to the docks," Lucian ordered, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "Bring Holden here. Do not let him pack a bag. Do not let him make a phone call." Bastian nodded once. The heavy doors clicked shut. Lucian turned back to the room. He walked over to the liquor cabinet, picked up 2 heavy crystal glasses, and poured a generous measure of dark amber whiskey into both. He walked back to Maeve and held one out. She looked at the glass. She looked at his hand. The knuckles were white. She took it. The crystal was heavy, cold against her palm. "Drink," he said. She took a sip. The whiskey burned like fire down her throat, leaving a trail of smoke and heat in her chest. She coughed softly, her eyes watering. Lucian drank his neat, emptying half the glass in a single swallow. "You understand what happens now," Lucian said, leaning back against his desk. He watched her carefully, testing the weight of her conscience. "Holden dies," Maeve said. She didn't dress it up in euphemisms. She grew up in the Bronx with a safecracker for a father. She knew how the world worked beneath the polished floorboards. "And there will be a hole in your organization." "A massive hole," Lucian agreed. Holden controlled logistics. He controlled the flow of materials. It is a highly complex machine, and the gears are currently grinding. He set his empty glass on the mahogany. He crossed his arms, looking at her in her faded jeans and cheap boots. "You see the friction, Maeve," Lucian said quietly. "You see the dirt on the floorboards. You hear the bind in the metal, and you see the lies in the ink. You understand the cost of a gallon of solvent, which makes you infinitely more valuable to me than a man with a master's degree from London who only understands the cost of a yacht." Maeve gripped the crystal glass tightly. The whiskey sloshed against the sides. "I am not a killer." "I have Bastian for that," Lucian replied instantly. "I don't need you to pull a trigger. I need you to keep the machine running. I need you to audit every single operation I run. The docks, the warehouses, the front companies. You will look at the mechanics. You will find the friction. You will point it out to me." He stepped closer. The proximity was overwhelming. The sheer gravity of the man pulled at the air in the room. "You aren't a ghost anymore, Maeve," he whispered, his slate eyes locking onto hers. "You are the architect of this machine, and I will pay you 10 times what Holden stole just to keep your eyes open." Maeve looked at him. She thought of her father, trembling and broken in a dirty apartment. She thought of the cold grey mop bucket. She thought of the paralyzing, suffocating fear of poverty. She looked at the ledger on the desk. She took another sip of the whiskey. The burn felt smoother this time. "I want my own office," Maeve said, her voice steady, hard, and completely unapologetic. "No windows on the ground floor, and I want the thermostat fixed. It's freezing in here." Lucian Vane stared at her for a long, heavy second, and then, for the first time since she had met him, the Mafia boss threw his head back and genuinely laughed. "Done." Did Maeve's sharp instincts and unapologetic grit keep you hooked? Sometimes the greatest power doesn't come from a loaded gun, but from knowing exactly how the machine works. If you loved this gritty, slow-burn tension and want more stories where street smarts outplay high-class arrogance, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a dark, intelligent drama, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next upload.